kick this off with an intro. I don't think Reid needs any introduction. So instead, I'm going to give you some context on his connection with SVC and the community. Reid has forever been reinventing himself and staying current. One of the things I most admire and I'm also jealous of is his constant capacity for learning. I think I'm nearing the age where I'm getting exhausted. But that set aside, when I left Dropbox and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to work on next, Reid was actually one of the first people I approached and had a first chat with. And then I met up with him a few months later and I said nothing excited me. So I created this learning group of 10 people who are really smart. And he talked me through some tenets that I should think about when creating this community. And one has stuck with us till today. He said, don't just look for entrepreneurs, look for domain experts as well. And that will help you theoretically prevent adverse selection bias. And it has tremendously helped us. And not only has it helped us, it's a goal that we continually try to focus on and make sure that we rebalance the community in terms of domain experts and entrepreneurs. And we've benefited greatly from it. Reid was also one of the first supporters of the SVC fund that helped the SVC community become financially sustainable, and has been visiting us every year, offering invaluable advice. So thank you for that, Reid. We're going to do this time's Q&A a little bit differently. Instead of focusing on or picking Reid's brains on like the general startup ecosystem, what markets are getting tailwinds from COVID, what he's seeing in the recruiting space. We've tapped into Aidan, one of our beloved community members and also domain experts. And he came with a very fresh outlook because he's from outside of technology in Silicon Valley. So he's going to drive the Q&A, and then we're going to leave it to the audience to ask questions about the tech ecosystem, the startup ecosystem, the macro investment climate. Again, Reid has pretty interesting points of views there, which I've adopted since, and anything else that you might want to ask him. So with that, I want to let Aidan kick it off.
Thank you, Ruchi. And of course, I'm absolutely amazed by you with where you're at right now. It's on your way to deliver. So you're an inspiration on a lot of levels, and just thanks for the opportunity. And good to meet you, Reid. As Ruchi said, I'm not from technology. So even though you truly do not need an introduction, I actually needed an introduction to you because I hate to say it, I'd never heard of you before. So and I know you are very well known. So then when I read your life story and what I could glean of it off of the internet, then I immediately wanted to speak with you because I found your background so interesting. And so the first question, we've sort of broken it down into categories of life story, life hacks, philanthropy and civic tech, politics, and in closing. But I wanted to touch on your relationship to philosophy too. But in any case, I think my first question for you is, every great founder has a second purpose. You've said something outside the main business they're trying to get done in the world. What is your second purpose?
Well, actually, I think it was my first purpose, where business is a tool for it. What I decided when I was an undergraduate at Stanford is that I kind of wanted to be very active in the intersection of two things. One is what I think of as the evolution of humanity, which is broadly cultural. Obviously with synthetic biology and genetics, we have a whole bunch of interesting things going on there too, but it's like, who are we as individuals in a society and who should we be? What should we deliberately move on a trajectory towards? And then as part of that, also to strengthen public intellectual culture, which I've done, I think, a modest amount of so far. It's one of the things that I hope for in the next 20 years, much more, which is the discussion, the discourse, the truth-based discourse on that. And truth-based doesn't only mean scientific or technological, but also, part of philosophy is I think there's various ways that you can reason to outcomes and values, and other sorts of what makes us our better selves, both deciding as an individual and as a group. And the way I got into business was I originally thought I was going to do it through philosophy, through academia. And when I kind of looked at what the path was to being a successful academic, it's like, well, you got to spend 10 to 20 years being a pretty narrow scholar on these things. And I was like, well, but what I'm interested in is that I've always had this instinct of yes, individuals, but also scale systems. And I started thinking about like, well, okay, how do you do the scale system? And part of what I realized was we are living in a more and more software-defined medium. That software organizes how we think, organizes how we connect to people. You know, I'd had a lot of experience of the pre-consumer internet as an undergraduate, as kind of like, okay, how these things work. And they said, okay, this kind of the definition of software systems. My original idea was a personal information manager, if any of you remember that term. But like define how we are and how we think of ourselves as people within a system, and how do I go help shape those in ways that is positive for society. And that was kind of the primary mission to which technology, capitalism, investing, entrepreneurship, business are all tools to facilitate that. They're not the mission unto themselves. They're the components that go into the mission.
So, I mean, that's really interesting to think about work as a tool, as a way of implementing your philosophy in the world and bringing your philosophy to the world, and hearing about the idea of human evolution as a culture. It might be said that we are in our cultural childhood or our cultural early adulthood. So I want to pivot there to have you talk about a formative experience of your childhood or early adulthood that really shaped who you are today.
So I think part of the reason why I got these kind of crazy ambitious goals to say, hey, because like it's a super strange thing to think, hey, I'm going to try to act in a way that helps nudge or interact, like helps participate in the evolution of humanity. The humanity is so huge, billions of people today, and this thousands of years trajectory. Isn't it like absurdly ambitious to make a difference there and to think about it on that scale? And I think that a lot of that kind of absurd ambition came from my childhood of reading a lot of science fiction, of these kind of heroic narratives. I also, for many years, I reread Lord of the Rings kind of every couple of years as kind of as an interesting kind of fantasy take on kind of what is the corruption of power, because you can look at the ring as power and how does that play within a landscape of individual choicing. And of course, part of the elevation of hobbits is kind of the, just having a sturdy character and having a kind of a local kind of a community as part of the basis of it. And I think that kind of set of experiences in its whole, I think, was very formative to me, because it made me realize it didn't delude me into thinking, like I am the hero of humanity. Like the fact that we are all in this together. But actually, in fact, if people don't think of themselves as potentially on a hero's quest, because a hero doesn't solve everything. A hero solves a thing, or a thing or two. And if all of us have that kind of heroic quest in mind, or many of us have that heroic quest in mind, and do that, then that's part of how society evolves. And that was kind of, I'd say, the kind of formulative set of childhood experiences, because it gave me the lens to kind of parse the various things that I was seeing as challenges. Like, for example, one of the very early ones was my mother was one of the very first women to go through law school. And she went through Berkeley Law School. And when she got to law firms, it was very common, and this is like the early 70s, very common for the male lawyers, because it was all male law firms at the time, to make jokes like, oh, the secretaries are becoming lawyers now, and hey, honey, can you get me a cup of coffee, and that kind of stuff. And kind of parsing her reactions, that was like, okay, there's a real problem here. What are the kinds of things you can do? And by having that kind of actually, in fact, you can go on a quest to make a difference in society. You can do that. That is a doable thing. And that's part of why entrepreneurship and kind of technology entrepreneurship kind of had an appeal to me, because it's like, oh, here's a quest. It's the entrepreneurship quest in order to go do these things. That was, I would say, the kind of lenses and sets of experiences within my childhood that led me to thinking, these are the kinds of paths I want to go on.
Well, I think that's interesting, the idea of ethics, the ethics of evolution, how our ethical lives participate in the overall evolution of humanity, and then how you moved from there.
By the way, I think the right answer is to always think we're children in process of trying to become more reasonable people. Like, one of the things when you look back, one of the funny things that so few people do is they go, like, everyone has this, oh, can you believe 50 years ago they didn't allow interracial marriages? Maybe it's 70 now, 50 years ago, and you go, okay, so what do you think 50 years from now they're going to be looking at us and saying, and what are the things that we could do to help with the right part of that trajectory? So I think it's always a kind of, it's like the day one, day zero kind of thinking on this is always, I think, a very good mode of thought for thinking about this ethical evolution.
Well, I think that moves well into another question of philosophy, and I've read that you taught a course on Wittgenstein at Oxford, and so I want to toss you what I thought of as an old chestnut of a question. I'm almost tossing it back to you. One I believe actually applies to the work that we do in our community here at South Park Commons, which is that if you're trying to talk to someone else about some problem and you're trying to make progress, how do you make language as positive an instrument as possible? Like, what are the ways that language can work, and what are the ways that language doesn't work?
Well, there's philosophy and there's pragmatism. The philosophy language is super interesting, as you might know, because it's the belief that many of our philosophical challenges are actually mistakes in language, mistakes in how we use language and understand language and so forth. And language is one of those many things that surround us in our lives where we all use it, or many of us use it, we grow competence in it, and we have no freaking clue how it works. And money is another one. I mean, well, we all use this, but like, what is the real way a system of money works? And that's part of the reason why you get these, what I think of as nutcases who go by, well, it's because it has to have a gold standard. And you're like, well, actually, that gold as money is just as equally confusing. So there's a whole philosophy side of it. And I do think that there's utility in thinking about what are the ways and blindnesses and the way that language forms, how we think of ourselves, how we communicate. Like, one of the things I remember when I got to high school, a phrase that I had been taught, this is blunt and easy, but like, I remember as a 5-year-old using the term Indian giver, right? And then the words came to my lips in high school, and I was like, whoa, what's that? Like, holy shoot, that like terrible, right? Because we create language in part as a political instrument of saying, hey, we justified that actually, in fact, the Native Americans gave us this land and then tried to take it back. And like, oh yeah, that was the history. But these kind of self-perpetuating ideologies. Anyway, there's a whole stack of stuff within philosophy and psychology and so on. Now, within entrepreneurship, part of where I think philosophy has been helpful to me has been being pretty crisp on a couple of different things. So, for example, in many consumer internet startups, I tend to think you should have a active theory of human nature that you are navigating. And one of the things, decade plus ago, I started saying in order to try to wake people up on this is like, I invest in one or more of the 7 deadly sins. Now, I meant that in a way to say that the 7 deadly sins are one kind of theory of human nature that goes across this very deep, kind of emotional kind of reflex, not to honor those and say, oh, 7 deadly sins are good, but you hook into it and you try to transform it, right? So people say, well, what is LinkedIn? LinkedIn is greed. You try to transform it into more higher order levels of being and how we work together. And there's a whole set of places where LinkedIn's designed around trying to move us into multi-transactive agents within game theory and, all the rest of that. And so, but like I've been looking at the last couple of years and I've been going, look, the point is not to enhance the sins. The point is to transform the sins, right? This is the point. Like wrath is not meant to be like, let's live in a total discordant wrath society. It's like, no, that's not the end target. Even though you may hook into that as a mechanism to try to transform how people are thinking. So one part of the philosophy is to have a articulate theory of human nature that you're playing into. Another part is to articulate a very specific kind of investment thesis about, here's my theory of human nature, here's my theory about what the way platforms, the way markets, or other kinds of things are shifting that gives this economic opportunity. This is my theory about, in the investment thesis, about how to realize that opportunity. This is the way that play out, so that you have a crisply stated investment thesis that then can potentially get to things where you're measuring things. Now, obviously, if you can get all the way down to A/B measurement tests, that's great. But sometimes it's measuring by talking to smart people and asking them about, hey, look, if I have this investment thesis, what's wrong with it? Like what would be the challenges? What would be the risks? Where would you see, what would be the landmine or something you'd see would blow it up or make this not work? So you have a good, crisp kind of view of it. And then the use of the language in that is to make sure that you're not doing language, because language has all these performative functions. And most often, like, for example, if you get off a stage, you turn to someone and say, how did I do? They're going to hear you saying, you want to have, you have some insecurity. You would like to have confidence. So I'll say, you did great. That was really wonderful, right? And if that's what you're looking for, then that's the way to ask that question. But if what you're looking for is, how do I learn? How do I improve? You turn and say, what do you think I could have done better, right, on that? And it isn't like, how did I suck? Because that's, like, okay, that may not as constructive, but like, what could I have done better? Kind of gives you kind of language and ways of improving. So similarly, like when you have a startup idea and you're talking to people, like one thing you say is, well, what are the risks? What if this didn't work, what would make it work? Because like, what are the ways that you think, maybe as a brainstorm, and like no brainstorm idea is a bad idea. You eventually evaluate and eliminate 99% of them. But like, what are the ways that this could be better? And those would be ways of doing it. That's less philosophy and more the pragmatics of how language interactions, or in Wittgenstein, language games, work between people. And there's many, many things going on in language games. I'll give you one last example of something that was kind of an interesting thing. In my freshman year in college, I critiqued a friend of mine who was saying, look, I'm helping people go discover truth because I'm going up and saying, you're wrong, right? Yeah. I said, yeah, well, look, that is one discourse to going to truth. And if you're talking to someone who is pretty comfortable on their feet when someone comes up to them and tells them that you're an idiot or you're wrong, then that's a, okay, constructive. And you're fine to talk to me that way. I'm perfectly happy being told I'm an idiot and using that as a discourse of truth. But you're also masking what you're trying to do is alpha roll the person to saying, I'm smarter than you are. I'm right and you're wrong. And that's implicit in what the language that you're doing are. And that, if you continue to do this, you should have the self-awareness that that's what you're doing and that's what you want to be doing. And that's an artifact. So I very rarely, when I'm trying to be constructive, go up to someone and just say, you're wrong, unless it's really desperate. Politics comes to mind. But more often I say, look, here are 3 things that I think you might really want to think about in the position you're in, because these 3 things lead me to a different conclusion than the one you have, right? Because I'm kind of saying, not I am better than you, but I'm saying, look, I have a different point of view. I have some reasoning and evidence for it, and I'm offering you my reason and evidence so you can come to your own kind of a point of view, because I'm not saying you're lower than me in this. Anyway, so those are nuances of the use of language.
I almost feel like we're in Oxford right now, walking down some street, some little alley, talking this way, because it's such a rich discourse. I mean, all these references you're making, even the 7 deadly sins, and unfortunate phrase Indian giver. It's almost like if we flip certain phrases around, like we made it giver Indian. And this is what I think poets are great at doing, is sort of reclaiming our language to to divorce that wrong direction that language can move in. I mean, I was thinking about the etymologies of certain words you were saying too, that sin, it really comes from a root word, hamartia, which means error. It doesn't mean like a crime against who you are. You're a bad person. It's just, you missed the mark. You didn't fire correctly, you know, or money relating to a word which means monitor, you know, and relating to a Greek goddess, some temple where you had to pay a tribute, where you had to keep watch, you know, and how this all falls back into the game. In fact, I was thinking before we move on to the next question, because I love the next question, you're talking about language games and science fiction. Have you read The Player of Games by Ian?
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, it's the Ian Banks that I most often recommend to people, along with Look to Windward.
Oh, well, I haven't read Look to Windward. Player of Games I've only read because Aditya actually recommended it to me, but it is one of the most fascinating games, language games out there, in another sense. So our next question is, you were famously named the firefighter in chief at PayPal for your ability to take on burning tasks that needed to be done. My grandfather was a firefighter, so I like the way that this nickname works too. The idea of actually going out, putting out problems. But how do you focus on how to put out those problems, how to scale your work, how to resist taking on tasks that may be interesting to you or that falls within your expertise, but you can't do it because you're running the battalion of firefighters, as it were. And now, is this intuitive, or do you have a system for understanding how to facilitate and delegate put out fires?
Like most interesting problems, it's a combination of art and science, right? So intuition in the art part, kind of an instinct. You literally can't be fully, at least within the scope of a human implemented algorithm, algorithmically solve, because there will be points of kind of perceptual judgment or instinct that will resolve some of the frameworks and decisions that you'll get to. Like within philosophy, there's this whole category of, and you can see some of it within the Malcolm Gladwell Blink, is there's a set of ways that we refine our judgments to have reflexive judgments that are largely on target. It's can of course be terribly bad. It's where hidden bias and in kind of homophily and systemic racism and other kinds of things can play in, but you try to refine, like we make tons of decisions on quick, intuitive, kind of blink decisions as ways of doing it. Now, that being said, there are frameworks to kind of ask yourself questions, which is like, roughly speaking, which of these problems, if I don't solve it first, is most likely to kill the project or otherwise seriously harm the project? And there's a set of things like that. It's like, well, you know, what's the possible outcome? How easy is it to fix later? What's the degree to which, you know, it's kind of like a coming train wreck, which is once you got it, so the two trains are going at each other and don't have brakes, the train wreck's going to happen. So you have to operate sooner on it. What are the kind of like inertia behind the problem? You can kind of do a very quick, and it's not perfect, but kind of a triage to which of these problems can be punted to later, right? And some, by the way, punted to later doesn't necessarily mean a significant cost for them, but you go, look, I can deal with that later. Sometimes, by the way, you look at it and go, look, I'd really like to be able to deal with that now, but I don't actually have the resources or knowledge to deal with it right now. And so even though it'd be better to deal with it now in a abstract problem solving sense, it might actually in fact be be better for just to try to tackle it later. And so now I'll give you the kind of the crispest kind of frame that I try to teach people in problem solving, which is to say, most often people don't, entrepreneurs realize this, because if they don't, they die, right? Their projects die. You more often than not have a much more limited time frame for making decisions than you would like. That you look at this decision and say, what's the actual time frame in which I need to make this decision? And usually that's shorter than you'd like. So you go, okay, first question, figure out the time frame in which you need to make the decision. Now, by the way, the fact that it's recoverable from, or you could change it, or anything else may make it easier to make the decision, but you still kind of, here's the time frame. Then you say, okay, within this time frame, what are the specific things that I can do? Not, oh, I'll think about it, I'll sleep on it, but what are the specific things that I can do that would give me information that would actually change the decision? Like if I were to make that decision right now between A, B, and C, I would decide B, right? And I go, okay, now, given that thing, what are the specific things? People to talk to, data to get, like research to run, other perspectives, et cetera. And what are the very specific things that I would go do that would shift that? Then which of those are doable in this time frame? Which of them are worth the energy and cost that this decision would require in order to do that and make it? And then go do those things. And while you're doing them, you might add or subtract something, but you're keeping a very specific list. And then you get to the end of that list, and if you can't, like for example, at the beginning, you can't think of something, you just make the decision, right? And it makes you really uncomfortable. It's one of the things that led to the kind of decision-making framework that led to the kind of another quote that I'm, really known for, which is, if you're not embarrassed by your first product release, you release too late. Because the usual answer is being totally comfortable about it is usually you're mistaking your time frames. It's a time frame and a learning-oriented quotation. So those kinds of things as decision-making for making decisions about fires, making decisions about the triage, because if you're not doing them, startups are basically default dead until you get to being a going concern. And it's a constant exercise in triage and firefighting. So if you're not making the decisions the right way, you basically won't win.
Well, that's really interesting, and it's it can also apply to ourselves as a society. To bounce back to our first subject, that if you're not embarrassed about your first product release, then you release too late. If you're not embarrassed about your latest development in civil rights, and if you're not embarrassed about your society's latest conference of justice to its people, if you're not embarrassed about that, then you release too late. And we all are always perpetually releasing too late. So it's of course a difference here. I don't mean to abstract too farther what you're saying. When you're at a workplace, you have to release. But of course, as a society, we have to think about what we're doing. But of course, we don't want to have that typical response of saying, "Oh, it'll all happen in time," without us being the ones who take.
Always have a concrete time of we need to make progress by then. We need to make a decision by then. This is one of the things I love about entrepreneurs. That is not news to any entrepreneur. Right. Other people usually need to learn that lesson, but entrepreneurs are usually pretty good at like, yeah, I get it. I got X time before the funding runs out, and if it's not working, I'm dead.
Right. Time is of the essence to govern ourselves well. That we don't know how much time we have ever in any sense. So I'll move on to another question here, which is specific to your work here. In 2018, you put 1.5 billion of your personal earnings into impact investments, making you one of the biggest impact investors in the world and a key supporter of civic tech. So what is the right institutional funding model for early stage startups in civic tech?
So, the impact investing is essentially just it's just another word for my approach to philanthropy. I do think there's a case where kind of giving away money is a good thing, and you give away money to kind of various things. But I approach things basically with an investment mindset. And so whether it's, putting money into a 501c3, whether it's putting money into a social impact venture or into a commercial venture or into a 501c4 or anything else, I always approach it with an investment mindset, which is roughly, this leader, innovator, entrepreneur, individual, group, team, this plan, this set of assets, this set of essentially goals, sometimes measured in OKRs or KPIs as a way of getting there and as a way of doing it. And that's kind of the way that impact investing works. Now, when it gets to civic technology, part of the specific challenges and this is one of the places where the theory of capitalism has some limitations, that if you're trying to get your highly profitable business by working within the civic arena, you're generally speaking taking pools of dollars from areas, and you're perverting the system some in order to get pools of dollars. Like an example of this is like the bail bond industry within our justice system. Like there's this whole set of entities that wants to like increase the economics and drive it all through the bail bond system, which then ends up with kind of horrific impact in racial injustice. You get similar kinds of things within prison guard unions, which is, well, we'd like to have more prisons, and we'd like to have more prison guards, and we'd like to have, because it becomes a tune to that. So you have to be careful, and obviously not all civic tech is of this variety. So I do think it's possible to do social impact. I think you have to have some very strongly delimited ways that the company operates in order to kind of continue to have your true north also be the impact. But it's also possible to do, I think, impact investing within, call it 501c3 environment. So one of the strong ones that I put a bunch of time into is Code for America, which is, fundamentally based here in Oakland.
San Quentin too.
Exactly. Yeah. And so what they did is they said, look, what we need to do is we need to apply kind of engineers and engineering mindset to building engineering problems for some of our key social problems. Most of them are altering the process by which governments operate, whether it's food stamps and CalFresh, or whether it's, ability to get your record expunged, which is super hard to do when you're poor and you have to jump all these hoops, and so causes the further systemic impression of blacks or kind of poor people, and ability to adjust to this, which of course is like the exact inverse of what you would ideally want to be a nobler society. Speaking of language, I'm still looking for the alternative synonym for noble that isn't based on, hey, we're the nobility, we're great, for this aspirational goal. It's, I think, a word that may need to be created. But but anyway, so Code for America started with this idea of like Teach for America parallel, but doing engineering, and then building up a set of systemic practices by which, kind of like mayors could say, look, here's a problem that we'd want. Will you come and work with us? And we'll dedicate some of the civic infrastructure to helping and getting that integrated the right way. But then you can build the code base that a lot of other places could use. And the same thing within California State and so forth. And so I think those are the kinds of things. And of course, because it's a 501c3, even though, by the way, it does have an economic model, and the idea is these projects launch to get to being profitable, it allows the governments to work much more easily with them, because they go, look, we know that nobody is taking home truckloads of cash to the bank and equity on the basis of this, so it makes it easier for us to dedicate governmental resources to solving these problems. It's a whole area that we could spend literally hours on to go in depth in this, probably like all these questions, but there are some, kind of quick darts.
Well, I mean, it is such a confined format to talk about it as well. It is something that really needs to be worked on by groups of people, and thought about collectively, I think. But the one phrase that struck out to me was true north among all of this. And another phrase, "eyes on the prize," comes to mind, right? I know you spoke about the Equal Justice Initiative earlier on, and it makes me think that this morning I was speaking to a woman named Gerline Joseph at the Haitian Bridge Alliance, I got to speak to her this morning in a similar capacity that I'm speaking to you now, with a group of people at Forward US listening in, and I was thinking, what an interesting, I'm grateful for my life. I get to speak to this Gerline Joseph in the morning, and then at the noon, I get to speak to Mr. Reid Hoffman. I'm all these different people who are all doing different work. But I posed her a question that I'm going to pose you now, that I think it's great that I can ask you both the same question and see what your different answers are. So it comes from a question by Ben Okri, a novelist, a Nigerian novelist. And he says, the most authentic thing about us is our capacity to create, to overcome, to endure, to transform, to love, and to be greater than our suffering. And the question that I posed Ms. Joseph was, what is the most authentic thing about you?
It's funny. This part's authentic and this part's inauthentic. By the way, just as an asterisk, I was actually some of the founding dollars in a Forward Us as well. Yeah. But it was on the civic side, like how do we take shots on goal? Because one of the things I love about entrepreneurship is try it, experiment, learn, refactor it, right? Like don't wait for the perfect thing, get engaged and do stuff. And of course you make mistakes. Make mistakes. Try to make not critical mistakes, try to make mistakes you learn from and then improve from and make better. But if you're not making some mistakes, you're not trying hard enough. And so I guess probably the most, I kind of don't want to throw a shadow of inauthenticity, because I try to be authentic across the board. Always be learning, right? Always be improving. It's like the ethical evolution. Always be trying to be totally present, genuine, and authentic. Probably the most authentic part of me is that intersection of, call it philosophical intellectualism and gameplay. Like when people say, hey, how did you learn to be an investor? How did you learn to be like a business person? The philosophy stuff and the intellectual stuff help. Precision of thought, precision of thinking about human nature, that kind of stuff. But actually, in fact, you can do all that really well and actually, in fact, not be a very good entrepreneur, in fact, not be a very good investor, and all the rest of it. And the thing that intersected with it was, like, I spent my childhood playing games, like mostly like Avalon Hill board games and other kinds of things. And I was looking, I generally had a preference for games that weren't like chess and Go, because even though chess and Go are super interesting games, they have a bad mismatch. They're badly mismatched to the games that we mostly play in society, which is like, oh, you have perfect knowledge and you have a perfect rule determinate system. And you're like, yeah, most of the interesting games in society don't work that way. And so part of what was good about, like, whether it's Settlers of Catan, which is obviously something I'm kind of known for promoting because it's like most entrepreneurship game, or Steve Jackson games, or Avalon Hill board games, and else, is actually having some randomness and having humans in the mix. Actually, in fact, get you a much more, like, multi-humans, not just this opponent that you're playing, get you actually a much more life scope of what kinds of games and the patterns of thinking about how you play those kinds of games to win, how you're flexible in strategy, like the kind of ABZ planning framework that I laid out in my first book, Startup with You, and other kinds of things. Like, it's that intersection of intellectualism and the gameplay that's probably the kind of foundation on this stuff.
Well, that is actually really clarifies an image of you in my head now. So I'm imagining you at a game board playing Settlers of Catan now, and now I feel like I know who you are better than I did when I first heard your name about a week ago. But so Settlers of Catan, I'll have to get into that. I don't know, I've never played it, but in any case,
it's someone to teach you, because it's useful for everyone. It's funny. It's very simple rules, but it's simple rules that come together in kind of almost like, it's not quite chaos complexity, but it's very hard to learn from just things. So go join like 3 other people, and then have them teach you. And that's the way to, that's the way to quickly get into starting to learning it from a basis once you can play.
I will. And speaking of what you said before, humans in the mix, let's get some more humans in the mix and open up the conversation now. Ask questions. Thank you. That was very interesting. We have, if anybody wants to jump in and ask their question, or should I read it?
Actually, Finn, do you want to moderate this section since you have a bunch of experience?
Yeah, sure. There's a great question that came in from Quinn. Quinn, do you want to just hop in and kind of ask it yourself? And take you off mute here.
Hi, Reid. My name is
Quinn.
Quinn. Hi. Yeah. Thank you for spending time with us. I wanted to start with first saying that I've also never played Settlers of Catan, and I'm not sure I have the patience to learn it, but that's an aside. So I am a physician, and throughout my education and training, I've almost been indoctrinated to not trust folks in the technology sector. And I think a lot of it is because we have this misconception that goals are different, rather than people in medicine and people in technology both wanting to improve things for humans. It seems like we're at odds. Like maybe people in medicine think they're better and that they're for humans, whereas it seems like folks in tech are for profit. And I think a lot of that is because our languages are different, right? In tech, disrupt means something positive. In medicine, disrupt means something very bad. And so like in this context where we're kind of just like butting heads, and when I say we, I mean medicine and tech, how do you personally approach these types of conversations to maybe get people more on the same page?
Well, one thing I'd say is, by the way, it doesn't necessarily mean you should like not all tech people are actually in fact true humanity missionaries, right? So I wouldn't advocate kind of the approach of, well, just like all tech people are this way. Like it's worth assessing. Are they there or not? There's a lot of tech people who are there for, they love technology. It's a path to fame. It's a path to money. But the key thing is that people think that because someone might be on a path to doing stuff that involves money or capitalism, that makes them bad. And that's wrong, right? If you look at scale impact, it's business models that like lead to essentially this kind of scale impact. And you need that business model to have the whole ecosystem work the right way. Now, maybe there's some future humanity that doesn't require that. But as far as I can tell, every system that I've ever seen requires something like that. So what I would say is have discourse and look for areas in which the person is very clearly overlapping the good mission with the economic mission. It isn't that they're absent economic mission, but they're looking at it as how do I kind of co-solve the problems? Because by the way, sometimes you have to say, look, I have a modest trade-off. Because by the way, think of it in medicine, the whole pharmaceuticals industry. I have some trade-off, like one of like the weird perversions is, actually, in fact, chronic diseases that I'm selling you the solution to is a much better economic model than selling prevention, right? It's one of the reasons why the industry works the way it does. And it's like, okay, that's a problem because selling prevention would be much better, right? And so we have to figure out how to solve that problem. But nevertheless, if they go, look, I'm trying to figure out how to both get an interesting business model, because by the way, that'll get investment and scale and a persistent organization and a lot of strength and throw it in society. And I'm equally attuned to the measurement of success. And what is the way that I'm being pro-humanity? I'm being pro the causes that you care about in this. And if you can have that discourse with them very genuinely, then you should absolutely look at them as a collaborator. Because, one of the things that I most often find amusing about, the current kind of tech clash and a bunch of other stuff is to say, look, I don't think that there's a scale to any of the significant problems. There's a scale solution to any of the significant problems that doesn't involve technology. Like technology is a fundamental component to solving these scale things. So for example, take climate change, right? So a lot of people go say, oh, we should all go get a whole bunch of people who agree to not be carbon emitting. And of course, the fundamental problem with that is you've got the billions of people who are not yet in these kind of middle-class lives going, okay, it's good for you because you've already done all the manufactured concrete and steel and all the other things that have made the carbon, but I can't do it? Well, to heck with you. And then, well, to heck with you, those billions of people, that's going to warm up the planet. And you say, well, but you should agree to sacrifice on this. And it's like, okay, look, what's the way to try to cut that Gordian knot? Well, we need to say, look, here, you can get into a middle-class life, and here's the technology that enables to do it, and we should make that technology available to you at exactly the same price or cheaper than the concrete and steel and all the other things, the transportation and all the other things that do that. And technology is the only possible solution to that. It's not actually, in fact, a global agreement, because that global agreement will actually never be captured anyway. And anyway, that's like one example of a number where you say, when you tackle this problem, how do you make technology as one of your central tools? Not necessarily the only tool, but one of your central tools in changing the landscape of how it works. And that's part of the reason I would encourage you to say, have that conversation, figure out the ones that are pro-humanity in solving the problem along with technology and business models, and that's hopefully where the solutions lie.
Thank you.
Thank you. Xander had a question. Xander, I just took you off mute. Why don't you go ahead?
Hi, Reid. My name is Xander. You mentioned The Lord of the Rings and the idea of heroes going on journeys to solve problems through your science fiction reading, and that inspired this question. The lone genius inventor is regarded as a myth in Silicon Valley. We say that all big changes are about building teams by convincing other people. But Frodo didn't form a C Corp and get the best person in Middle Earth for each person of his hero's journey. In fact, he had to do the opposite, leave behind all of his companions. So how important is lone genius? And is the importance of lone genius changing over time?
All these, not surprising, these are all great questions. This is one of those places where I generally tend to have a reaction of thinking about false dichotomies, which is it's both really important to have the eccentric, the contrarian, the lone genius, et cetera, and it's really important to have a network and work and support. And like one of the things that, I put in the Startup Review, because I deliberately said Startup Review to have I think people all thought it was individualist, but it's actually in fact meant to be plural, like again, playing in language between singular and plural. You allows that ambiguity, and sometimes playing in ambiguity is an effort in language. And so where the quote unquote lone genius is really critical is that sometimes there's huge progress unlock is that realizing that different thing, that contrarian thing that could actually in fact be really right, whether it's a scientific theory, a organization of society, a new product or service, a way of approaching a problem in public health or education or something else. And usually that requires someone who's kind of cutting against the grain, because we do tend to be social animals, political animals, creatures of the polis, back to kind of Aristotle. And so we tend to have a lot of groupthink in that, and you need that edge. On the other hand, scale solutions, implementing things, almost always requires a network, almost always requires a kind of a team behind it. And I think that part of the recognition of that is to say, actually, in fact, this network, this team is absolutely key, not just because they all follow along and they're the hands to the lone genius's brain, but actually, in fact, when you look at the high performance, they actually bring in a lot more thinking, a lot of refinement, a lot of, well, you had good intuition here, good idea, but we need to do all these things differently in order to make it work. And so I think the short answer is kind of a both answer, right? You need both very badly. And it's one of the things that I think is frequently is we kind of go, look, these kind of things, which looks like they pull in different directions, but it's the fusing them together in the right ways is where you get the really great solutions. Now, I'll go to another language thing just because of Aidan's opening, but one of the frequent thing is people go, oh, best of both worlds. And whenever you're thinking of best of both worlds, you also have to think about the worst of both worlds, because almost any real opportunity where you have the best of both worlds, you also have the real risk of the worst of both worlds. So it's an important thing where you got to go, okay, like we're putting together these catalytic things, hopefully for a creative explosion. And by the way, creative destruction is not one of my favorite phrases, although Schumpeter really did bring that in. And I think the creative disruption is to say, how do we rebuild to the new is really important. And sometimes it's really important to get rid of the old and doing it. Anyway.
Thanks very much.
That's great. Let's go to Kathy. Kathy had a question that was actually very similar to the ones that Michael and Mary also sent in.
Yeah, so mine is more around risk tolerance, right? So traditionally, if you're a philanthropic investor, you expect basically 100% impact. You're only scaling impact. Versus if you're kind of like a tech VC, you expect most of your investments will fail. So when you think about this, how do you balance these expectations where kind of you're trying to do the best of both worlds?
So, roughly speaking, I tend to think you can't really accomplish anything heroic, back to the very early thing, without taking risk. And if you can't identify the risk that you're taking, then either you're not really actually, in fact, usually on that big of a thing, or you're not blind to it. So part of what I do on almost every project I do is I try to identify which risks we're taking and what are the risks there. And not necessarily to manage them to zero, but to align it into the theory, that investment thesis of, if I happen to be right, I got to go through it. And so I think everything, like actually, in fact, I think we'd be much better off as a society as opposed to trying to persuade ourselves that we can actually live risk-free lives. Because like you drive on the highway, you drive between San Francisco and San Jose, you're taking a risk, right? Because you're not the only person on the road. And by the way, no one's driving skills are totally perfect or anything else. Even if you're like, well, I try to be tired, not tired, you're fully awake and I've practiced and all the rest of it. There's always some risk. Now, there's places where you have this vanishing, diminishing risk curve, which is kind of the equivalent of zero, and that's fine. And so you can kind of round those to zero and operate as if those are zero. But I think it's generally speaking, the way to look at great projects, including investing, is how do you take intelligent risk? And I think this is one of the things that actually frequently breaks a lot of philanthropy, because somehow when people come and allocate capital, they're looking for total risk-free. They're looking for, like there's really no kind of risk premium on this. And of course, they don't have any of the, like, part of what makes it operate within the commercial sector is because there's so much capital that goes into it, you could take a risk, fail, and go on and do the next thing if you kind of do it in the right way. Whereas that doesn't exist within the philanthropic side. So I understand the incentives and all the rest of it. So that's part of the reason why, like, back to the kind of impact investing, like I mostly put the vast majority of my capital into places where, in a philanthropic sense, where I'm enabling this individual organization to take a risk and to do something where something can play out in that as a way of making it happen. And you have to have enough, like, for example, the people you're working with have to believe that you will support them in their next thing, because too often our narrative story where it's wrong is we go, it's the hero who never had any failures. I've had a lot myself personally, right? And it's the person who didn't succeed, who just failed. And you're like, well, no, the outcomes based in a risk environment is like a really bad heuristic of making these judgments. And so I tend to think actually being risk intelligent, like learning how you take smart risks, learning how you kind of measure the risk, manage it. Because like roughly speaking, when you say, well, where are the really great heroic projects? They're the ones that actually have a smaller risk profile than most people think, that you can kind of make an effort, smart play to control, not perfect, but smart play that can sometimes have the really outsized impacts in the world. And then that's the place to be looking for, where are these Archimedean levers by which I can move the world in some really interesting way? And that's the shape of it. And so that's I don't know if that's the exact answer to your question, but that's kind of how I think about risk and these projects.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. We have a lot of questions, but we're a bit short on time. So I want to go back to Aidan, who had a couple questions in closing. Aidan, why don't you go ahead? I think you might be on mute, Aidan.
There we go. It's always embarrassing when you do that. But in any case, there's a whole list of questions that Benjamin Franklin posed in his Junto club that I like to pose among the South Park Commons community. First one, it's like intricately phrased, but have you met with anything in the author you last read remarkable or suitable to be communicated to the Junto, particularly in history, morality, poetry, physics, travels, mechanic arts, or other parts of knowledge? Have you read anything good lately, is what he's saying, really.
Yeah, no,
I was going to summarize that. Have you read anything good lately?
I've gotten a couple books that I'm hopeful for, but actually, in fact, during pandemic, I've been so busy, I've actually not gotten time to reading. I guess I'll say the book that was pre-pandemic, which is an old book, but I think very good. It's called The Swerve. And it was kind of the reinvention. What is a set of things that got to the Renaissance? And to some degree, it's kind of this question of like the Renaissance. Like what I think is interesting is it kind of moved from the focus on God to the focus on people. Right? Obviously, it was man and kind of being vaguely sexist, and because the times and morality of the times, but like to humankind. And one of the things that was this kind of shift in focus can be a really important thing for an kind of like creating because what we'd like to do is we'd like to be constantly going into to better and better renaissances, and I've been thinking about how to do that. And so The Swerve, I think, was a great piece of history to think about it. It wasn't in The Swerve, but it was in something else I read that also hypothesized that one of the things that enabled the Renaissance, speaking of technology, was invention of good mirrors, because people could start studying themselves and looking in a mirror. And on one hand, you'd say 7 deadly sins and vanity, but on the other hand, you'd say, well, actually focus on humankind. Don't focus on the only the impossible divine.
Well, vanity, vanity.
Yes.
With that, Reid, I wanted to thank you for your time. We don't want to keep you over. I might actually send you the list of unanswered questions if you ever feel so inclined to write us back.
Okay.
And
You may inform me, like doing some writings and speaking and other things, and I will send them to you as they happen.
That would be great. So we'll follow up with that. And again, thank you very much for joining us here. We really appreciate all your support.
I love what you guys are doing. The South Park Commons is awesome. Right. So